Hello, this is Brian Rowe with Mythic MTG Tech. As you probably noticed, yesterday I put out a top 10 list for Conspiracy, and somehow I missed that Stifle was in the set. This video is my attempt to make up for that oversight. I've dedicated an entire video to Stifle. This card is incredible. There's a love-hate relationship with Stifle in the Legacy community. People either really like it or really hate it. I am on the love side. As far as complicated cards go, this is an 11 on a scale of 1 to 10. It takes a mastery of the format to really play well. You need to know what's going on, what cards are likely to be in your opponent's deck in order to play this card. Let's jump into the rules aspect of it first. Stifle counters two things: activated or triggered abilities. Activated abilities are those abilities in which there's a cost, colon, and then an effect. So Icy Manipulator here is a classic example. The cost is 1 mana and tapping the artifact. The effect is tap target artifact, creature, or land. With Stifle, you can counter what is after the colon. Triggered abilities are abilities like those on the Oblivion Ring, the when or at abilities. We're going to look at lots of examples, so if you don't have it yet, don't worry, you will by the end of the video. Also, I'm a rules advisor, not a rules judge anymore. If I missed anything on this and you're a judge, please leave comments. I will correct anything with later annotations. Continuous effects, static abilities, things like Crusade cannot be stifled. Those areas that are before the colon cannot be stifled. It doesn't matter what the effect is, it's how the effect is written. So even though Spirit Link and Life Link to a new player look like they're the same card and doing the same thing, the way these two abilities are written matter a lot for Stifle. Spirit Link is a triggered ability. When the enchanted creature deals damage, you gain that much life. By contrast, Lifelink is a static ability. So Lifelink happens without using the stack. Lifelink cannot be countered. Spirit Link, because it's a triggered ability, can be countered. Another parallel example here is Armadillo Cloak versus Unflinching Courage. Armadillo Cloak has that triggered ability whenever and can be countered. Unflinching Courage is a static ability of lifelink and cannot be countered. When in doubt, get a judge, ask for the oracle. Lots of older cards have been errated to where it's very easy to figure out if it's a static ability or if it's a triggered ability. Oath of Druids, the oracle text now includes an at the beginning of each player's upkeep. It's extremely clear when it triggers, when it goes on the stack, and that you can counter it. Almost every deck played in Legacy, and most of the decks played in Modern, have multiple abilities. Spine of Ishtar is one from Mud. You have no idea how depressing it is for a player to spend 7 mana to get this card out, and then realize that it's been countered by a 1 casting cost blue spell. Yes, the Spine still makes it out, but the triggered ability of destroying a permanent does not happen. Candelabra of Tawnos is another one. Now this is really interesting because it's really on an old template, but it's clear because of the colon that it is an activated ability, and this does also tap the Candelabra. Mono artifact means that it can only be used once, and the new templating would have the Candelabra tap. It's really targeting a bunch of lands and untapping them, so you can counter that. One of my earliest interactions with Stifle was the Stifle Not deck. I really enjoyed putting out a 12/12 for 1 casting cost and 1 more to keep it in play. The when ability on it can be countered, leaving you with a 12/12. Unfortunately, Abrupt Decay has pretty much killed that deck currently. Gem Palm Incinerator is a really interesting one. So is anything else that has cycling. With cycling, you often have two distinct abilities. You have the cycling, discard this card, draw a card, and you often have a secondary ability. When you cycle, something happens. Each of those are separate abilities. One's an activated, one's a triggered. You can counter either one with Stifle. If you wanted to counter both, you would need to use two Stifles. Stifle is amazing because it is land destruction and it's land preservation. It is so powerful because everybody uses fetches in Legacy and in Modern. Yes, Stifle is not legal in Modern, but I'll get to that in a little while. But it's also a way to preserve your dual lands. It is a 1 casting cost counterspell to Wasteland's ability and a 1 casting cost land destruction to someone using fetch lands. One of the happiest times I've ever been using Stifle was to stifle my opponent's pay 7 life, draw 7 cards. They still pay the activation cost, but they didn't get any cards. I was able to burn them out playing Rug Delver the next turn. Elves deck has a lot of activated abilities and triggered abilities. Crater Hoofs, when comes into play, often opponents go for a really early win with this. You're able to counter that triggered ability, and then they don't have lethal damage. Deathrite is one that is often confused with regards to Stifle. The exile a target land in order to gain mana looks like it's a mana ability, that it wouldn't use the stack. It does use the stack because it has a target, so you can stifle that ability and prevent them from getting mana. I've seen people try to counter the return a forest to hand aspect of Kenoran Ranger before. I've seen a wasteland go after a bayou gets returned to hand. It's important to note that the return a forest is part of the activation cost. You cannot counter the activation cost, only what comes after the colon. I love countering miracles. Nothing feels better than watching somebody manipulate their deck for several turns, pop their top on your turn with the intent to use Terminus to blow you out. You can counter the miracle ability when it goes on the stack with Stifle. Pernicious Deeds is another one that can really hurt if it gets stifled. Definitely lost 1 or 2 bug games against Rug, where I was trying to blow up my opponent's Delver of Secrets that had flipped, and they countered it. When you counter it, you're still going to lose the Pernicious Deeds. It's just not going to have an effect because the sacrifice is part of the activation cost. Emrakul has some amazing things on him. One of them is when you cast it, take an extra turn. You can counter that. But the more impressive thing to counter is the Annihilation trigger, leaving you with all your permanents and the ability to swing back and kill your opponent. Empty the Warrens and Tendrils of Agony are the main win conditions in most Storm decks. A counterspell doesn't stop these because it makes copies, and all of those copies would need individual counters. But Stifle allows you to stifle the Storm trigger, so none of those copies ever make it to the stack. Equipment. Ooh, equipment takes a beating because of Stifle. You often put several mana into getting the equipment into hand, getting the equipment on the board, attempting to attach the equipment, and then they can stifle the equip. Equip 2 mana is the activation cost, and then you attach it to a creature. You can counter that attaching to a creature. You can also wait for them to spend the mana, attach it, and then counter one of the other abilities. With Jitte, you can counter the counters getting put on Jitte. You can also counter removal of counters. The counters will still get removed. The effect won't happen. Stoneforge is one of the toughest cards to play against Stifle. You often have to be careful of which ability you are countering when you have a Stifle. Your opponent may already have a piece of equipment in hand when they use Stoneforge Mystic. So Stoneforge Mystics come into play is often not the best thing to counter. It's often worth waiting until they've searched up a piece of equipment, put it in their hand, and then spent 2 mana and a turn later to bring that equipment into play. They don't show you what equipment they're putting into play with the Stoneforge Mystic ability until it's resolving. You often have to guess what equipment is in their hand and whether it's worth countering that ability and then watching them try to manually cast it, or whether it's better to wait until the equipment comes in and counter an ability on the equipment. Batterskull, for example, it's often worth waiting for the Batterskull to come into play and then stifling the living weapon part. The living weapon is when the equipment enters, triggered ability, you get a 0/0 germ token. So they end up with a Batterskull that has no germ, and often it's early enough in the game that they don't just have 5 mana to attach it to something else. So they have to spend 3 mana to return it, 2 more mana to put it back out, and then your tempo game is going extremely well. They've wasted a lot of time on trying to get one single answer out. My favorite thing to stifle is clearly anything that gives my opponent massive card advantage. Stifling Jace's ultimate is wonderful. Stifling Liliana's ultimate is also extremely good. Even stifling the suspend trigger when Ancestral Visions tries to come off of suspend is extremely powerful. It's basically a 1 mana counter spell that stops or counteracts several turns of powering something up and then attempting to use it for massive advantage. For anyone who's new to playing Stifle, I strongly recommend adding Gitaxian Probe to your deck. Knowing what your opponent has in hand and what all of your options are, having perfect information makes Stifle a much more powerful card. It's a great way to learn, and in several decks, the Gitaxian Probe is an incredible advantage in and of itself. If you're going to play Stifle, strongly consider playing Gitaxian Probe. Also want to let people know that I am personally speculating on Trickbind. I believe the Trickbind is modern playable. It is an incredible card. It has split second, so it cannot be countered. It stops most of the combo decks that are out there right now. I look forward to playing this in the upcoming modern season, at least as a singleton and maybe as a 2 or 3 of, because fetch lands are all over the place in modern. Trickbinding a fetch land or 2 when you've got a Delver in play seems like a wonderful way to keep your tempo deck rolling while slowing your opponent down. Thanks. This has been Brian Rowe with Mythic MTG Tech. Thank you to everybody out there on Patreon who sponsors the channel. Please consider sponsoring the channel. I greatly appreciate it. Also, thanks to Magic the Seattling and SCG's article Final Judgment for help putting together this article.